Morning. And well, we are done with Amos. We finished Amos last week, and we're going to be rolling to the big, whopping book of Obadiah. I know it's intimidating in length. It may take up a whole page of your Bible. In mine, it's really large print, so it's 2 pages. So, first things first, just to kind of introduce this small book, I want to ask y'all a question. What do you know about Obadiah? Written to Edom, about Edom, right? That's a pretty big shift from what we've been talking about and reading through, right? It's been, declarations towards Israel and Judah, right? God's chosen people of the Old Testament. But here we get a shift. It's to another nation. Anything else that y'all made about the book? It's also judgment. It kind of fits in that theme, right? We get a lot of the day of the Lord talk and some things that we've been talking about through some of our other minor prophets. Anything else? Well, if not, I'm going to do some just general background information on the book real quick, because it is a little different. And we've already stated this, but this actually centers around a different nation for the most part than what we've been talking about. It centers around the nation of Edom and the Lord's judgment upon them. Now, this is a nation that was located somewhat near Israel, Judah. It's located, southeast of Judah, between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of, I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I goof it up every time, but Aqaba, something along those lines. But why would Edom be, important? That's actually the biggest point of the book, right? Is they're distant relatives to the nations of Israel and Judah. So they're considered a brother nation, right? Closely related. This ties back to, Isaac and Jacob and Esau in the Genesis story, particularly Genesis 27. What happens in Genesis 27? Jacob gets the birthright. Esau sells his birthright for Jacob for what we normally call like a bowl of beans. And, Edom's never happy about that. And the tension is what something through this book you see. Edom does not like Judah or Israel because they feel like they should have the birthright that their ancestors sold. So that's kind of the background of the book a little bit, is you're getting some of these family ties, family tension. And I'm sure with Thanksgiving that just happened, we all have some of that on the brain. But this tension between them is a historical thing as well. You see it throughout several books that when Edom pops up, they kind of push back against Israel a lot. So let's read a couple of these real quick. Can I get somebody to take Numbers chapter 20? We'll be reading verses 14 through 21. And can I get somebody else to take the 1 Kings 11, 14 through 17 here in just a moment? When whoever wants Numbers, just take it when you're there. So here we see it. All right, this is Moses and the people wandering through the wilderness, and they need to pass through Edom to, well, keep getting to where they're going. And does Edom respond positively to this? Actually, they're quite adversarial about it. They send an army out to stop them from passing. Edom says, go around. Can somebody take the 1 Kings 11 passage? 11, 14 through 17.
Now the Lord raised up an adversary against Saul, Cade the Edomite. He was a descendant of the king of Edom. For it happened when David was in Edom, and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the slain, after he had killed every male in Edom. Because for 6 months Joab remained there with all Israel, until he had cut down every male in Edom. But Ahab fled to go to Egypt, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him. Ahab was killed in
Here we have a passage where you have, well, Israel attacking Edom. And God even raising up an Edomite against Solomon. And you see all the background there that it talks about with Hadad. And, well, how David attacked Edom and slaughtered people. And, well, it's a brother nation. They've both committed atrocities. They both have problems. But they're brothers. And this is the background of the book. And God is passing judgment upon Edom for some of this. And we even see back in Amos, Amos condemns Edom for its participation in slave trade. And, well, we're going to get a continuation of it. It's no, well, I think coincidence, especially as we get into the book a little bit, that you read Amos, then you get Obadiah right behind it. And, well, like I said, there's been historical atrocities on both sides. And both sides have a problem. But God's dealing with Edom here. So, just to kind of throw a little bit more background out there, Edom sought an alliance with Babylon, roughly 593, or sought an alliance with Judah, 593-ish, to, well, withstand Babylon eventually. But Edom kind of flipped around, actually joined in with Babylon, and participated in the siege and assault on Jerusalem from 588 to 586. Edom actually helped Babylon take Jerusalem and Judah and, well, conquer the nation and ultimately sending them off to exile. They helped exile their brother. So, anything on background info before I kind of get in the last little topic on it? If not, the book is interesting to try to date a little bit. We kind of had this conversation with Joel some as well. It lacks a lot of like precise historical events referenced to just say, you know, it happened on X, Y, D. But also the name Obadiah doesn't really help. It refers to about 12 different people in the Hebrew Bible. It just means servant of the Lord. So kind of general in the sense too, even on its meaning. So that doesn't really help date the book. The references in 10 through 14 to the looting and ransacking of Jerusalem kind of lend itself to the Babylonian exile. And that's the idea we're going to work with this morning. So we're going to generally keep it around that 586 to 553 Babylonian time period, just as we have our discussion this morning. But, I mean, people have dated this everything from the 9th to the 4th century BC. So before we get into the book itself, anything... Well, if not, let's actually read what we've been talking about. Can I get somebody to read verses 1 through 4?
The vision of Obadiah. Edom will be humbled, thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise against her without. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. Pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of a rock in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, it will bring me down to the ground. But you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars. From there I will bring you down, declares the Lord.
So this consists of an announcement of judgment upon the nation. God is going to judge Edom. This is actually similar to things you see in Jeremiah, particularly Jeremiah 6:8 and 51:27 through 28. But I think the emphasis here is Edom's going to be made insignificant and lowly among the nations. I mean, the language here. Look, I will make you insignificant, verse 2. Deeply despised. Your arrogant heart has deceived you. Edom's had a pride issue. They've thought highly of themselves, and God is going to bring them low. I mean, even this, they think they soar like an eagle up in the sky, not to be touched. But God's going to bring that eagle down. That's the Lord's declaration. We've hung on those words a lot as we've read our minor prophets so far. It pops up a lot, and it's an emphatic statement of this is how it's going to happen. God's going to bring Edom down. So, anything y'all see in verses 1 through 4? Okay, well, if not, can I get somebody to read 5 and 6?
Thieves came to you, and thunders came by night. How you have been destroyed. Did they not steal only enough for themselves? A great gatherers came to you. Did they not leave gleanings? How Esau has been pillaged. His treasures sought out.
So, we see that whoever it is that's going to ransack Edom, ultimately Babylon destroys Edom, they're going to ransack the nation and leave nothing behind. There will be no remnant, right? Especially with what we just read at the end of Amos. Remember what God says to Israel there, right there at the end of chapter 9? A remnant's going to remain. Edom's not getting that. Actually, we're about to talk about it a little bit, but the agricultural images here, if you go read Isaiah 63, this seems to be a source of economic wealth for Edom. They seem to have great vineyards. Isaiah alludes to this. So this discussion there in verse 5 of the grape harvesters and no grapes left, economically drying them up. But this idea of no remnant left for Edom, they're not going to inherit anything. But that ties to the end of Amos. Unlike Israel, Edom's not going to have anything left to inherit. But turn back one page. We're going to read Amos 9:12. 9:12. Remember, this is that chunk of Amos we finished up on last week, where like the whole language of Amos shifts. It's been judgment, 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 and then restoration. And here, Amos says something interesting. I'll start in verse 11. In that day I will restore the fallen shelter of David. I will repair its gaps, restore its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom. And all the nations that bear my name, this is the Lord's declaration. He will do this. See, even in the end of Amos, we see Edom's not going to inherit their remnant. Israel will, Judah will, the people of God will inherit the remnant of Edom. And Obadiah, the book itself, I think alludes to this in these verses. How Esau will be pillaged and hidden treasures searched out. When they're ransacked, they're ransacked. When they're destroyed, they're destroyed. And nothing will be left for them. Okay, anything on 5 and 6 and the Amos connection, anything? If not, can somebody read verse 7?
All the men of the confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They have eaten thy bread and laid a wind company. There is none understanding in him.
So, this most likely refers to the idea that nations, Edom is considered allies made treaties with, are going to betray them. They're going to be the ones to destroy the nation. It's what Babylon does to them after the siege of Jerusalem. They've made this alliance with Babylon to remove Judah off, well, their own land. And Babylon destroys Edom as well. And here I think this is a, well, reference to that idea. That, well, these people you've helped raise up will crush you. This reflects the peril they brought upon. But it's interesting too, because starting in verse 6, you get the idea of Esau, right? He calls them Esau in verse 6. So Genesis 27 in mind. Is Jacob right with what he did? When he, well, tricked Esau basically into selling the birthright for next to nothing. He's praised for it, yeah. True, very true. But would Esau see it as right? No, Esau didn't, absolutely not. But does that excuse what Edom's done to Judah? Betrayal on one side doesn't make betrayal on the other fair, if that's how you're looking at it. Just because you don't like what they did doesn't mean you get an excuse to go at them. Even if it's right. If you don't like the right thing they did, definitely not an excuse to, well, attack them, to help another nation destroy them in this case. This is violence against a brother. Gordon can speak to that. I've hit him quite often. Hey, he hit me back. But that's what this is. Violence against brothers. It's people you should be the closest to. I mean, Edom should have, well, knowledge of the covenant with God in some form or fashion. And here we see God's condemning them for what they've done. And this just becomes all the more clear. So anything on that idea, verse 7 or anything?
In the Old Testament, when God deals with punishment of nations, he doesn't stand a tremendous amount of time discussing what he's going to do. The bulk of what he says is destruction against Israel and Judah. Because they were his covenant nation. They had all the blessings. Edom initially had all the blessings. Esau was the firstborn. He was to get double the inheritance. He had the blessings. He should have had everything that God promised to Abraham to go to Esau. But he resisted equal kindness. The evil was on his side. He did not recognize the blessings he had, and he sold his blessing for almost nothing. Jacob couldn't make him sell it. He offered, but he couldn't make him. Esau very voluntarily gave up everything that should have been his from God. And I think he broke the covenant. He broke the initial covenant through Abraham. And it seems like God is most severe when people break a covenant. He had a covenant in way with Syria because he had sent Jonah to them, and they had repented. And he had blessed them because they repented. Yet they turned right around within a few years and attacked Israel. They broke the covenant. So I think most of us what we see it in God's punishment is any time a covenant is broken, there will be retribution because God wants us to honor all of our covenants, be it marriage, be it commitment to Him, whatever our covenant is, God expects us to live up to His covenants and keep them.
Mhm. And it is interesting, too, the idea that Esau knew what he was doing, in a way, when he sold what he sold off to Jacob. And here we are, this is, years and years and years after, and Edom's still frustrated about it. But like you said, Hebrews points out the fact that Esau was well aware of what he was doing. He actually didn't seem to care that much. Yet Edom still uses it as an excuse, and that's the problem. Edom knows better. Hence, part of the reason this judgment's being poured out about them. Think about it. God takes time even here in our, what we would think as our Bibles, our canon. To include this, to show, even with the knowledge, maybe not the direct people of God in this case, in this Old Testament context, have judgment poured out upon them for what they know. Even if they haven't followed God, they still know. And God still judges them based upon what they still know. What Esau knew. They want the covenant now, but Esau didn't want it then. And obviously they aren't trying to live up to a covenant either. Anything else? Patrick.
It's interesting that God had already said he was going to judge Edom all the way back to Balaam.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the last of the oracles of Balaam, when he talks about it, and I had to look it up because it's that part in Numbers 24, and he's actually seems like he's talking about the Savior, right? Because he says, I see him, but not now. This is in verse 17. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. He shall crush the forehead of Moab, which was where Balak was from, right? He'll crush the forehead of Moab and break down the sons of Sheph. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemy, shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of the city. So it's interesting when you have this messianic statement from Balaam, and in the midst of that, it's still talking about relatives, right? Moab is a relative in a way of this whole family situation, and so is Edom, and there's the tie-in with Seir and Sheth and everything. So God's already talked about this, and people just don't, and even though God's still talking, right? He's still talking to us, and we still don't want to pay attention.
Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting, too, in light of what we read in 1 Kings, God has used Edom at times to bring judgment upon Israel and Judah. But Edom is now it's their turn. Especially as we get a little later on in the book, I think it'll be implied that Judah's had their day of the Lord. Now it's your turn, Edom. And even back then, as far back as Numbers, close to where we read in Numbers 20 as well, Edom should have known what was coming. That, hey, God will judge us too. And here we see it start to be poured out. Anything else before we bump on to our next couple verses? If not, could somebody take verses 8 and 9?
Lord, not on that day, declares the Lord. Destroy wise men from Edom and insane from the mountains of Esau. Then your mighty men will be dismayed, O Canaan, so that everyone may be cut off from these mountains which are not yours.
So these couple verses are pretty simple. It's the Lord himself declaring judgment against Edom. And it's one they're not going to withstand. It's pretty consistent with the image of the minor prophets about judgment. You don't really withstand it, the judgment of the day of the Lord, those kind of things. It's more of a question of, do you endure it because you're with God? And Edom here we're seeing probably not. And an interesting thing here, it makes note of their wise ones or their wise men, and they're not even going to be able to figure out how to withstand this. The wisest men of Edom. I think this is just interesting, especially with some of the Psalms and things we read, like Psalm 19, right? How God is just more in wisdom and power and might and everything. I think even here in Obadiah, they're touching on that just a little bit. But God, wiser than the wisest man, the smartest man, all of it. And even here, Edom's not going to be able to figure that out. And even the next verse, your warriors will be terrified. doesn't matter how strong they are, doesn't matter how smart or wise they are. God is declaring judgment. And it's described as a slaughter. That's a tough picture in a lot of ways. It kind of goes right along with Amos. It's been a lot of judgment pictures. Anything on these couple verses?
Just kind of reinforcing the wise men. It was sort of Job and his three friends to be some of the wisest men that ever lived. And when Job was in trouble and his friends come to see him, it says in Job 2 verse 11, now when Job's three friends heard of all his adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Manahathite, I'm not sure you said that, where they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him. So Eliphaz was a Temanite who was in from Edom, and he came to mourn with Job. And we do consider these to be extremely wise men, so that's kind of a reiteration. I think they probably were very wise in the way of the world, men in Edom. But they're going to be destroyed. Their wisdom's not going to be able to stay with them.
And it is an interesting connection bringing out the Job there with one of his friends being from Teman. And the Edomites pop up all over the place in the Old Testament. Even in the book of Job, you get one. And it ties directly into what he said here about wise men. And Job is a good thought here with this idea of God and wisdom. Job is a fairly wise man. You see that written all over the book, the way he talks, the way he speaks, the way he thinks. And most of the book of Job is pretty, well, Job is mad and upset. And that all sets the stage for what happens at the end. I repent in dust and ashes. Job repents in sorrow and mourning because he's confronted and has to realize before a holy God, he doesn't understand everything. That's one of the fundamental things about Job. God doesn't have to fit what you think. He didn't fit what Job thought. And Job realizes that in the end, that like, hey, I don't understand everything God's doing. So I'm going to repent, accept his will, and do what he's asked. And you see that Job is restored. I mean, everything he had at the beginning, he gets that and then some more. And that's the wisdom that Job tries to bring across to its reader, I think. Okay, God, I don't understand everything, but you do. So I'm going to be with you. I'm going to let you guide me. And obviously, God's guiding Edom somewhere. It's destruction because they haven't put their wisdom in him. Okay, anything else for our next couple verses? Jeff.
They're related to the Israelites, but they never were in captivity. They never got delivered by Moses. They never were made a covenant people. They never had the law. And while God is punishing people for their lack of ethics, they weren't breaking the law of Moses because they never had it. And I have known Jews, but I've never known an Edomite.
Go down I-20. There's a place called Edom, Texas. You get one. Not going to lie, Jeff, I had that line prepared because you say that every time Edomites pop up. But you're right. But you're right, though. They didn't have the law. They didn't have necessarily, quote unquote, the prophets the way Israel and Judah do, right? They don't have guys like Elijah running around that we know of. But God still judges them because there still seems to be some kind of standard. It's actually, especially next week, if we finish Obadiah today as we get into Jonah, I mean, God sends Jonah to Assyria. There's still some kind of standard for them, even if it's not, quote unquote, the law. So, God, they've fallen short of their standard. And especially people like Edom, a brother people, they're well aware of that Abrahamic covenant and the expectation God had upon even their forefather. And they're falling short of it, it seems. Anything else?
Romans chapter 2 begins to look at sort of
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that has all changed now because we're all in the law of Christ. And that's the only way to come to God now. He's referring back, I believe here in Romans chapter 2, to those before. Because when chapter 3 say all the sin and fallen short of the glory of God, there has to be some standard for them to have sinned against, for there to be sin. So he had standards for everybody. We have a special, separate covenant law for Judah to bring us to Christ.
And Romans is an interesting book to bring up here. Because, I mean, the fundamental questions of Romans is, how does anybody stand before a holy, righteous God and be approved of anything, much less his presence? You don't. It's the fundamental thing. There's only one way to do it, and you didn't do it. Christ did on the cross. And the first couple chapters, especially Romans, are highlighting that the people without the law didn't do it. The people with the law didn't do it. Because both violated the very thing the law was trying to even push people to. God. That's the thing. You get a lot of talk about the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law was to push them, make them realize, hey, we need something more. We need something greater. We need a sacrifice more than what we've been doing. Hence, I mean, the spirit of the law was to highlight, hey, I'm sinful. And I need something to remove that. And obviously, Edom is sinful. And God sees that. And obviously, they should have seen something as well. It may have not been by the law, but obviously they're held to some kind of standard. Anything else on these couple verses or anything we've read so far? Okay. Well, can I get somebody to read verse 10?
For the violence against your brother Jacob, the shame shall come on you, and you shall be cut off forever.
Just shows the result of this judgment, right? The violence Edom carried out against Judah, or Jacob, with his both names in here, Jacob and Esau, in the book. God makes it pretty clear what they're being judged for, like why this is happening. It's for what they've done against their brother. And he makes it pretty clear what the result is going to be. And I think of Genesis 12, 1 through 3 with this. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. I think Edom would have been well aware of that. It's their, common ancestor. It's their common idea. And you see it. They've cursed Judah. They've attacked them. They've hurt them. They've tried to destroy them. Well, I will curse those who curse you. Genesis 12, verse 3. Edom's been cursed. Edom's going to be destroyed. And it's all for what they've done against their brother, the covenant people with God. Patrick.
It's one of those places in Deuteronomy where Edom is discussed, and it's in 23. And the statement that's made in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 7, it says, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. And then it goes on to say, you shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were sojourners in the land. Children born to them in the third generation may enter the assembly of the Lord. This is right after he says, Ammonites and Moabites, no. Right? It's like 10th generation for them, even though David is ultimately not the 10th generation from a Moabite. But it's interesting that they weren't supposed to abhor Edom. No matter what, this is Moses at the end, right? The 40 years of wilderness wandering are over. Yes, they said, don't come through our land, but they had a lot more problems than just the Edomites. But at the end of the day, God's direction
Hmm. I mean, God has, it seems, an expectation for their relationship with one another. You're not to hate each other. You're not to despise each other. You're to respect and care for each other. Because, and this ties back to the, well, Genesis narrative. Is Genesis 27 the end of Jacob and Esau? No, actually, they reconcile to one another. They come back together. Esau does want to, well, wring Jacob's neck for a while, but they do reconcile their relationship. They come to a point where they don't, in the Numbers language, abhor each other. But obviously, Israel, Judah, and Edom don't see it that way. Even after they're told. I mean, we read the First Kings, and Patrick pointed out Second Kings. They do horrible things to each other. There's crimes on both sides. But that was never what they were meant to do. They were meant to respect each other. And we see what's happening once that's failed. Okay. Anything else on verse 10? If not, can somebody read verse 11?
In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his horses, and foreigners entered his gates and cast off for Jerusalem, even we were as one of them.
This just shows that, well, Edom didn't only just help take Jerusalem and destroy, they rejoiced. They were happy about this. Now, this brings to mind yesterday in college football, I don't know why every single team wants to plant their flag in the middle of the field. But think about it. I think it's a decent analogy. All these teams are planting their flag in the middle of everybody else's field yesterday, and what broke out? Pepper spray. Yes, Ohio State, Michigan. But think about it. You already beat them. It's a rivalry week. That alone is sweet enough, right? But it's another step, another insult to go take a flag, or in the Arizona State situation, a trident or pitchfork, whatever they were supposed to be, and go stab it in the middle of their field, because that's saying, this is my ground now. This is our house. It's another level of insult. Brandon?
That brings up a comment for me. When we beat A&M, Steve Sarkisian told our players to get out of the middle of the field and come on. He did not want us to do that. He said there's no use in that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
It's stupid.
it's insult to injury. Well, this time, at least in the Obadiah case, it's insult on top of destruction and exile. So, Obadiah planted their flag, and it's a problem. So, this just shows how bad this relationship's become, though. I mean, not only do they help destroy, they rejoice in it. They're happy about it. This brings them joy and rejoicing. And they act like the foreigners. The people not related. The people who, well, aren't brothers. They're right there with them. Anything else on that? If not, we'll move off college football for a minute. Hey, can somebody read verses 12 through 14?
Do not gloat over the day of your brother, the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not lose wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress.
So, this shows what Edom has done to Judah and acts as a rebuke of their actions. Right? I mean, don't gloat over your brother in the day of calamity. Ties right back to the verse we just read, right? Don't be happy about this. Don't rejoice over the people in the day of their destruction. Don't boast. In verse 13, don't enter my people's city gate in the day of their disaster. yes, you do not gloat over their misery. We spent a good time in Amos talking about city gates and kind of how that connects, right? Like, this is that place of justice in the Old Testament where, well, court happens and justice is to be carried out, and they're just trampling onto it, gloating in the day of their disaster. Don't appropriate their possessions. Don't take their stuff. Don't go raid their city. Don't be happy about this. Don't stand at the crossroads and cut off their fugitives. Don't hand over their survivors in the day of distress. I mean, okay, rejoicing is one thing. Helping sell them off is another. They're stopping them from running away, and they're helping sell them off, send them off to exile. This would be wrong. This is not how they were to act towards each other. They helped exile the people. They kept them from fleeing. Edom has committed an atrocity. I mean, exile is bad. And here, Edom supported it. There's one other thing here. If you notice, in these 3 verses, you get the word day repeated, over and over and over. And it's not in reference to Edom. It's reference to Israel, Judah, right? In their day, in their day, in their day. A lot of people, when reading this, take it as an implication that this is meant to be the day of the Lord for Judah, Israel. That, that's what it's trying to convey, that, hey, this was my judgment upon them. It's not your job to come help it out. That this was the day of the Lord for them. So, anything on those handful of verses? Well, if not, we'll hit the last chunk of the book. So, this brings that day of the Lord idea to the forefront. All right, the day of the Lord, judgment carried out throughout the prophets. Several passages, we've read about it several times at this point in our study of the minor prophets. And there's some ideas here, right? Historical in nature, right? Each book has its immediate context, what it's talking about, but also kind of has some end times, eschatological looks to it as well, right? Both somehow historical and reflection of what happens at the end. And this is no different. A lot of times in the prophets, they seem to often kind of bring these events together when they're talking about it, the way they use their language and some things. So, with that in mind, somebody read verses 15 and 16.
The day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed.
So, this is a direct call of the day of the Lord upon the nations. It's not even just Edom now. It's all nations. This is, so far through the minor prophets we've read, the first time we see the day of the Lord as all nations. We've seen judgments individually carried out. That's the beginning of Amos, but this is the first time the term, the day of the Lord. See, Obadiah is trying to bring across to its readers the fact that this day of the Lord, it's not just Israel and Judah anymore. All nations are going to have to deal with the God's judgment. Edom's going to it. We see Assyria have it happen, especially in our next book. Babylon will have it happen. Persia, Rome, it does not matter. And here, Obadiah, I think, is trying to get the reader to move it through. Okay, anything on 15, 16? Okay. Can I get somebody to read 17 through 21? This just shows restoration of God's people, starting at Zion, not Edom, but the people of God, particularly in the immediate context, Israel, Judah. And 18 to 20, to put it simply, outline like a geographic expansion that they haven't seen before, right? I mean, they're taking, well, it seems everything. Possess the land of the Philistines. And, I mean, everything. A geographic expansion unlike anything they've ever seen. And also highlights how they're going to dominate. I mean, they're like a raging fire. They're going to take upon the land. And then verse 21 kind of wraps it up, makes a final call out against Edom, and, well, how God's going to rule it from Zion. And it seems to be an eternal rule, that this restoration is not a temporary thing, but something fixed, I would say, eternal. I think it has its immediate fulfillment, at least in the direct context of Obadiah. It's going to be 553. Edom's just wiped out by Babylon. Kind of hanging back. They had a treaty with Babylon, and Babylon turns around and says, kind of hard to uphold a treaty when we can just crush you. And we'll crush his Edom. I think it also prophetically tells of a time when God's going to rule all nations. 3 quick applications, because we're almost out of time, and to finish the book and keep us on pace for what we're trying to get through. 1, violence against a brother matters. I mean, it's the whole fundamental thing here with Obadiah is they've committed crimes against their brother. The day of the Lord and the establishment of the Lord's kingdom. Obadiah is pushing the narrative. Treat each other well and look forward to the day. Okay, anything else before we close it? If not, thank you for your attention. We will be in Jonah next week.